This is a stanza-by-stanza analysis of Afternoon with Irish Cows by Billy Collins. The title immediately introduces a few important elements. Firstly, the characteristic humour of Billy Collins's poetry, the idea of hanging out with cows for an afternoon being fairly whimsical and light-hearted. And in a similar vein, we're introduced to the simple, uncomplicated nature of the poem. The phrase afternoon with Irish cows feels casual and conversational. But finally, we're also introduced to the concern that lies at the heart of the poem, the importance of identity and belonging. These cows are not just cows, but Irish cows, Ireland being a country that has fought over or fought for its identity since the Norman invasion resulted in the country being put under English rule in the 12th century. The opening line continues the casual tone that was set up in the title, the phrase "a few dozen" being very non-specific. The speaker has noticed the cows, but he's not noticed them enough to know how many of them there are. He's a passive observer. But the cows are also personified. They occupy the field. This is a word we associate with power. It suggests the cows have asserted themselves and taken the field for their own. They belong here and they know they belong here. It's clear that Collins wants us to read the poem as a personal recollections. He says things like "where we lived" and "I would sometimes." And the impression we get is of a young, inquisitive boy passing time by looking at the cows in the field opposite. These phrases could also add to the conversational tone I mentioned before, which continues throughout the whole poem. Notice that most of the stanzas begin with some kind of discourse marker. So we have "then later," "but," "yes," "then I knew." All of these give the impression that the speaker is talking freely and musing on memories from childhood. The cows are presented in this stanza as gentle, harmless giants with their big heads down in the soft grass, the monosyllabic words perhaps reflecting the speaker's or the boy's view of the simplicity of their existence, with the peaceful setting being emphasised in the soft consonants and sibilants here, stepping, tuft to tuft, heads, soft and grass. There also doesn't seem to be much to them at this point. They don't do anything other than roam from one tuft of grass to the next as they graze. And the repetition in this line, tuft to tuft, suggests the monotony of the cow's existence. The description of their big heads emphasises this. It's a very simple description that makes us think of docile, harmless creatures despite their size. We also see the speaker's young naivety and innocence in the final two lines, where he looks out to see the field suddenly empty and imagines that the cows have flown away off to another country. The speaker is taken aback by their sudden disappearance, and his fantastical imagining of where they might be hints to us that there is more to them than their otherwise apparently very monotonous grazing. The language in the final line here suggests that there is something a bit mysterious or even magical about them. Maybe the speaker subconsciously recognises the captivity of the cows and wishes that they could have taken wing and escaped their lives of stepping all day from tuft to tuft. Stanza 2 continues to set the pastoral, calm scene, with the cows returning to their field, which would be full of their munching, or they would be lying down in the black and white maps of their sides, facing in all directions, waiting for rain. The continued use of present participle verbs here, so munching, lying, facing, and waiting, creates a timelessness, and therefore a peace and contentment to the scene. The cows are still fairly passive, none of these verbs particularly giving a sense of power or assertiveness. But again, there are subtle hints that there is more to the cows than we might think at first glance. He describes how they're waiting for rain, perhaps referring to the popular belief that if a cow lies down in a field, it means it's about to rain. Perhaps these cows know more than we do. The metaphor describing their skin as black and white maps is a really interesting one. We use maps to guide us, so cows are again being given more power at this point. It also links to the imagery in the final line of the first stanza, as if they'd taken wing flown off to another country, once again contrasting the cow's restricted life in the field with the freedom that the boy's imagination grants them. What we're starting to see is a clear sense of place in the imagery that Collins is employing. I mentioned earlier that this is a poem about identity, and identity is of course linked to a sense of belonging, so imagery of place is really important. The final two lines of this stanza prepare the reader for the change in tone at the beginning of the next, setting up our anticipation that this calm scene will be interrupted. The enjambment brings our attention to the word appeared in the final line. They appear or seem patient and dumbfounded, but perhaps their calm exterior hides something else underneath. There's a sense that the speaker is beginning to form a new sense of admiration and respect for the cows, and is aware that he can't fully understand them. He can only look at what they appear to be thinking, feeling, doing. In the final line, the long quiet of the afternoon also seems to anticipate a shift. It's too unnatural. It's almost the calm before the storm. As I said, this stanza begins with a change in tone, but, which harshly breaks through the calm, drowsy, long quiet, just like the sound so phenomenal that the boy occasionally hears one of the cows make. The use of phenomenal suggests that the sound is not just remarkable and exceptional, but also that it's a phenomenon that needs explaining, which the boy seeks to do as he stops what he's doing and walks over the road. It's worth noting that the activities the boy is undertaking are pretty mundane, much like the munching of the cows in stanzas 1 and 2. This could be an early subtle hint at the shift that's going to take place by the end of the poem, but more on that later. Once again, the boyish imagination of the speaker's past self takes hold here as he hears the sound and immediately has these violent and rather shocking visions of the cows being hunted and tortured or killed. The violence in these lines comes as a shock to the reader. The finality and onomatopoeia of torched and pierced, starkly contrasting the peaceful present participles that we saw in stanza 2. Again, there's a shift in the way we're seeing the cows at this point in the poem. No longer are they docile, simple creatures, but we now understand that the cows have sensibility and feeling and can experience pain. Of course, do remember that this is all happening in the imagination of the boy. They're not actually being tortured. The yes that starts this stanza is conversational, creating intimacy between the boy or the speaker and the reader, as the voice further seeks to explain the phenomenal sound. He sees that it comes from the noisy one, which sounds like a term of endearment or a childish simplicity, and this noisy one is anchored there on all fours, firmly planted on the ground, strong and powerful. Like the word occupied in stanza 1, this metaphor suggests that the cow has chosen to be where she is. She wasn't put there by someone else. It also tells us that she will not be moved against her will. She's standing with her neck outstretched, her bellowing head labouring upward. The connotations here being that she will not be silenced and her voice will be heard even if she has to labour for that to be the case, perhaps like the Irish themselves given the title and the context. The description of the sound continues. It's a rising, full-bodied cry that began in the darkness of her belly and echoed up through her bowed ribs into her gaping mouth. This description of her insides makes the sound seem primeval and instinctive and being all-consuming as it reverberates around inside her. Collins is perhaps comparing this sound to a mother's cries giving birth. Think about the alternative connotation of labouring in that fourth line. And I wonder whether the idea, therefore, is that the cow is giving birth to, or giving voice to, its identity, making it tangible through sound. Visually as well, the images of the darkness and the echoing and the gaping mouth emphasize this sense that there are hidden depths to this creature which we cannot understand. So what we learn here is that the cow is far from simple and docile as we thought in stanza 1. Collins suggests that this sound allowed a realization within him or within the speaker, as it was then that he realized, in fact then that he knew, the cows were not, as he originally thought, patient and dumbfounded beasts. The verb knew here suggests absolute certainty. This is a kind of epiphany. He explains that the phenomenal noise that he heard was the cow announcing the large, unadulterated cowness of herself. The word cowness here is a neologism, which means a made-up word, which reflects the childish perspective that we've seen throughout the poem. It allows for the humour of the situation to come through. After all, he's commenting on the moo of a cow. But perhaps it also suggests that the cow will not allow her identity to be bound within the confines of the English language, possibly making a connection to the desire of the English to anglicise Irish place names or impose the English language, and the Irish resistance to this. The cow's cowness is unadulterated, meaning pure and untainted. She is asserting herself without apology here. The use of the adjective large might make us think back to the big heads of the cows from stanza 1, but the connotations seem much more positive here. The cow is now a powerful creature deserving of our respect. We're told that through this sound she is pouring out all the ancient apologia of her kind. An apologia is a formal written defence or justification of one's opinions or conduct, and this overly formal language adds some humour. Remember that we're talking about the moo of a cow, but it also suggests that the cow feels that she has to defend herself and the other cows around her, her kind. The Irish landscape is evoked with the return to the pastoral in the final 4 lines, especially through the limestone hills, with the cow being very much part of this landscape. Remember what we said before about the imagery of place being an important part of the sense of identity and belonging. Notice also that she's pouring out this apologia to the fields, the clouds, the hills, and the bay. She's announcing herself to nature, not to the boy or the speaker. This ties in with our realization at the end of the poem that the cow is very much part of the landscape, but the boy is out of place. She regarded my head and shoulders above the wall with one wild, shocking eye. She is wild like the landscape, while he is comically reduced to simply a head and shoulders. Now, I mentioned before that there'll be a shift by the end of the poem, and this is it. Whereas the poem began with the boy observing the cows, now the cow is observing him. The description that ends this poem, wild, shocking eye, is an interesting one, as it's not clear who it is shocking to. Are we as readers implicated in this? Are we all guilty of being shocked by others' differences, or of trying to impose our identities on those that we shouldn't? Whatever the answer, the cow's unadulterated cowness is clear at the end, as her identity is asserted through the pun on the homophone I, with the personal pronoun I, as in I myself.